If you can't read the title, this says The Dawn of Happiness-Guided Policies. And thank you for the introductions. I enjoyed Chris's introduction there because I'm an academic, and I have come at this, in a sense, from a researcher's point of view. And so the premise of this talk is that economists, psychologists, and some allied disciplines have been learning about the science of well-being now for some decades. And I'm going to give you a very brief sort of tour of my view of the history in recent years. And so the idea there is to understand what is it that makes for happy people, happy communities, happy societies, happy countries. And for a while I would say, many of us were happy to say, look, this seems from everything we can tell to be really important. It seems to be revolutionary for economics, but it's also complicated, and we're not really ready to start saying, hey, here are the policies that we can roll out now. And so as that science grew, and there's sort of a self-help psychology, how to be happy kind of field as well going on at the same time that came out of positive psychology, which is part of the heritage of the economics of happiness. But as that science grew, people who took it up in all walks of life, essentially anybody who had some influence over an organization, a management position, a community, and tuned into this knowledge, were able to find ways to apply it and to change the environment of the people around them and the ways of doing things in order to make everybody better off. And so the premise of this talk is that we're kind of now maturing to a point where we actually can start to talk about the top-down part of the policy. What should central governments be doing? What should large, maybe city, provincial, federal governments in the Canadian context be doing? I think my original offer was just to kind of give a report back from the World Government Summit that I attended earlier this year, where there was, every year now, there's an international dialogue of happiness, and I'll sort of give you the context. But 2019 was the second year that a group has published something called the Global Happiness and Wellbeing Policy Report. And the idea is to start trying to spread knowledge, survey practice, and spread knowledge for governments in this topic. Okay, so relating to the introduction, I am going to commit the error of trying to simplify things. So my story is going to be one of relative simplicity. And in fact, the report is very nice because it really does talk about complexities of policy, and implementing everything is difficult, extremely contextual place to place, and it's all about, of course, relationships and trust building and a lot of processes which do not happen quickly. But I assume that not everybody here is familiar with the basics science of well-being, so I'm going to start from there and try and convince you that we have a wonderful world ahead of us in which we really have a much more sensible way to hold our society and our elected officials and our governments accountable to what matters for humans. So the thing that I want to talk about today is best thought of as something that can be easily and transparently quantified as follows. And while often something slightly more vague and general may be applicable in the context, in policy context, it's really useful, and I'm going to talk about data which really literally comes from a single survey question like this. So if you like, close your eyes for a moment and think about this. I don't even see the question written there, so that's missing. The question is, taking all things into account, how satisfied are you with your life these days on a scale of 0 to 10? 0 is completely unsatisfied, 10 is completely satisfied. Now, somewhat strangely, most humans, and there have now been millions, pose this question every year for over a decade in 150 countries, are able to answer this question quite readily. Most don't refuse. They're able to do it in a matter of seconds. And on the surface, it's a bit of an absurd question. It's highly subjective, so economists might have a lot of natural aversion to it. And the short story that I'm going to sort of gloss over is that after several decades of research, we have a lot of confidence in the meaningfulness of the responses we get. Let's just think a little bit about the cognitive steps that somebody has to go through if we pose them this question. The first one is to have some idea of what is salient to a good life. What are the criteria for oneself? Could be, in principle, entirely individual, entirely idiosyncratic. What is salient to one's aspirations or one's values of a satisfying life? And then one needs to seek evidence in order to assess how those domains or aspirations are being met. What kind of evidence do we have? Well, what have you got? I mean, you can appeal to your sort of midbrain, your emotions, so you can remember your recent affective, in a psychology language, states, your recent emotional states, your current emotional state. And then you can look for more cognitive things, and this can really encompass anything that the cognitive part of our brain, the cortex, gives us. So maybe there are events that relate to our aspirations, accomplishments, and then so one gathers, in some sense, this evidence that relates to one's objectives or relates to salient things to a good life, and one has to aggregate it. So in principle, you have to weight the different things that are important to you. And once you've done that, in some sense, I'm being abstract, one has to translate it into this bizarre scale which the survey is asking for. Okay. For some reason, we're able to do that quite well. It's noisy, so there are differences in some sense of what an individual might give in the same circumstances as somebody else, if that's a sensible comparison at all. So there might be something like individual set points. There are a lot of individual circumstances which look like noise. So let me be more clear. There are genetic components to people's responses, right? And then there are an awful lot of environmental, of situational aspects of life that relate to this. In fact, in principle, everything relates to this. So the empirical work in this field is rather hard, right? It's actually difficult to isolate causes because, in principle, absolutely everything can affect life satisfaction. Okay, just to point out, there's a couple of things this question, which is not actually written there, sorry, is not. I'm not asking for people to tell me what they think is important for a good life. I actually, as a researcher, almost don't care. I mean, it's a little bit interesting, but I almost don't care about that answer. I really do care about how good life feels, because I think every individual is an expert on that. And I'm not going to dwell on this, but it turns out people are not experts on counterfactuals. They're not experts on other possible universes. They're not experts on what would make life better, even though they may have some experience that makes them partial experts. They don't know about all the possible other situations. And so you can do a lot better, it turns out, by looking at the natural variation across a population and also even changes over individuals' life and see how life feels in different situations. And then by knowing what those situations are, statistically determining what is supportive of a good life and what isn't. That's actually turns out to be better than reflecting on our own intuition of what things are important that I maybe haven't experienced yet. What would I like to improve on, and how much would that do for my life satisfaction as compared to something else? And those kind of marginal trade-offs, that's cost-benefit analysis. That's what you have to do if you're making policy, if you're allocating resources. And so the theme of this talk, the theme of using happiness as a guide to policy making, is really about using the science that we get from surveys that have this question in order to do cost-benefit analysis differently. One more thing that I've maybe already made clear. This is the class of question we would call this is a cognitive evaluation of life. So another thing it's not is, hey, how are you feeling at the moment? Which ironically is actually, I would call happiness, right? Are you happy right now? And so when I use the term happiness, and most of us in this field, we're actually using it in a loose sense. And often we might mean it vaguely as subjective well-being measures like this one, which include other things like short-term emotions, so how happy are you right now? Often it's actually just often people, especially in economics, mean a life satisfaction question or some other cognitive evaluation of life, even though they call it happiness. Okay, so that's sort of definitional. And feel free to interrupt me. I'll repeat questions to the microphone if anybody has questions as we go. I think there'll be lots of time at the end, but it's worth stopping for clarification. Okay, let's just think about how cost-benefit might look a little bit different for a few sample topics. So let's say we're wondering about what the cost to society or to an individual is of being unemployed. A conventional focus might think about lost income. Might even slightly more sophisticated one might think about human capital depreciation. So while you're unemployed, you're no longer learning on the job and your skills are becoming out of date or whatever. But informed by the happiness literature, one actually finds out that while those things are important in affecting life satisfaction, just or in fact much more important are the loss of, a challenge to identity, the loss of purpose and the loss of relationships at work. So changing relationship in, say, relation to one's family from not being employed, loss of relationships at work, change of identity, loss of purpose. Turns out that unemployment is much, much worse for life satisfaction than the loss of income it implies. What about, say, public housing? If we're trying to allocate resources to public housing, I think Trudeau has just done that directly or indirectly. What's the value of public housing? Well, we can come up with all kinds of maybe conventional things which would go into a cost-benefit analysis, which, people are actually trying to do this thing. That's, it's not the only thing that affects decisions, but that kind of cost-benefit analysis goes into budgeting processes. Public housing is probably good for health outcomes. Where does it save money? You can imagine health system, all that kind of thing. Well, I would say, and allows people to get a stable job, employment, etc. As a well-being researcher, the first things that would come to mind are more along the lines of dignity and inclusion and community-level identity, right? So it turns out that if you're trying to explain variations in life satisfaction, let's say not even at the individual level, but actually by location, true for the individual as well, variations in, so the degree to which people feel like they belong to their community explain more of the differences in life satisfaction than variation in income. Right? So it means it's more important to live in a place where people feel like they belong than it is to be wealthy, in that sense. If you're focused, if your metric, if your objective is life satisfaction. Health. So I'm going to talk more about health later. It's currently, it's a very hard thing to evaluate one treatment or outcome versus another. So I'll talk about it later, and I'll talk about mental health. But just think, how dare we as a society, not that this is strictly what we do, but how dare we evaluate something like anxiety only insofar as it reduces productivity? Right? That's something that we do sort of implicitly because those are the tools that we have and the focus that we have. Life satisfaction, having the ability to get at people's well-being in this direct, subjective but quantitative way, also fills some really big gaps in the tools that economics or reveal preference has for things like non-market choice. So economics is good at, economics focuses on evaluating things for which it observes behavior. So if I can see people making behavior, then as an economist I have a way to evaluate what I think is good for people. But a lot of choices are not observed, or in particular not in the market, and so it's very hard to measure them in commensurable ways, like dollars. So non-market choices, for instance, let's say I have a policy that I want to improve trust in government, sort of for its own sake. Not just by being good, but actually thinking, beyond the actual policy outcomes, I might value people having trust in the process that's going on in government. We don't have a way to evaluate that with conventional measures. Right? That turns out, though, to be very important for life satisfaction. In fact, even income itself, the way in which we value income, the way we have to think about the value of differences in income in a happiness context is pretty radically different. And I'm only going to touch on this, but it turns out that part of the benefit we get from having a higher income is in relation to the standards, the material standards we see around us. And so that means that part of the benefit of raising everyone's income is lost to these reference effects. Okay. So it turns out that in the mid-20th century, sort of for reasons of pedagogy, in essence, we got rid of what the founders of economics thought, which was that our preferences were highly social intrinsically. Our motivations and our behavior and our preferences were highly social. We simplified things to pretend that we really didn't care very much in many ways about what other people were experiencing. We only cared about what we experienced ourselves. So, and you know, economics is often criticized for making this assumption of the strange asocial nature of Homo economicus. But it's a fair question to say, okay, that is a weird simplification. How big a deal is it? Life satisfaction can answer that, and it turns out tells us it might be an absolutely enormous deal. It might sort of undercut an awful lot of what we think and do I would say, in economics. Okay, there are other things for which we don't even make decisions. Not just that they're not observable to statisticians, but we don't even make decisions. So if we are consuming public goods, say things that the government provides that everybody gets, it's very difficult to evaluate the benefit of those to individuals. We don't, if individuals are, say, not making costly decisions to benefit from them. So, you know, public goods or other things you don't make decisions about, like weather, right? We actually don't pay for the weather, we don't choose it. So if you want to know, say, direct effect on well-being of a change in weather or climate, lots of people are actually doing this now because, funnily enough, those signals are now big enough to actually measure, then you could go about that. That may not, that's only weakly related to policy maybe, except through climate change. But it's true of other public provided goods, right? So we have kind of weak ways to do that kind of thing in economics for, say, a national park with a lot of problems. And if we're measuring individual well-being, we can think about doing that in a way that's actually maybe more comparable across people and more all-encompassing than current methods.
Chris, can I make the microphone a little closer?
Really?
People at the back of the room.
Thank you.
Well, I can move the microphone. Whoa, that's the wrong way to move it. Hold on, there we go.
How is that? I can, maybe I should raise it.
So they can rotate it here.
Okay, I'll try and really speak into it. Okay, so I should probably move on from this, but you know, as I just mentioned, you know, you can actually compare across individuals better in some sense if you're measuring life satisfaction at the individual level. You don't have to worry about the fact that observed market decisions have maybe a different meaning for people, so somebody with very little spending power to those who have lots. And then another large topic, I'm not going to dwell on today, but this is where it gets quite profound. I would say for a lot of what we do in economics, we don't like to be paternalistic in economics, but it turns out, as I referred to earlier when I said I don't care so much what people think is going to be good for them, that humans don't necessarily always do what's in their best interest, right? So with life satisfaction, I can actually say here is what the outcome actually felt like afterwards, even if you didn't choose it. So, I mean, yeah. So let me not dwell on that too much. But in fact, you can show this in even a quick psychology experiment, as well as in very large scale phenomena, right? So people's choices about, say, how much they choose to commute versus where they live and their income seem to be systematically biased, meaning people underestimate the effect of certain things on their life satisfaction. In a lab experiment, you can do something similar where it turns out that people's predictions of how happy they're going to be after something very simple are less accurate than data you can offer them from what other people have experienced. In other words, when you're making a decision in life, your best bet may be not to go with your own introspection about what's going to be best for you, but to go with data. Now, it's a different question of whether when you offer people data, they still actually don't always take it. They may still go with their introspection. So you don't need to be paternalistic in the sense of forcing people to do something that's going to make them happy, but for goodness sakes, surely we want to at least be asking the right question, have the data, and offer it, and make decisions in the interest of the actual human outcome. Okay. So there's a whole other issue here of, which I'm not really going to get into again today, this is a bigger issue, but imagine the possibility that there are firms out there who, rather than meeting demand, create demand. In the sense that they may be making something which is addictive, harmful, and actually doesn't benefit society. How do we evaluate that kind of outcome if in a sort of traditional economic GDP framework, the only way we have to evaluate it quantitatively makes it look pretty good if it creates economic activity, right? It's possible, it's conceivable, if we could measure things properly, that there would be some economic activity like that which was actually entirely negative, or net negative. Okay, so I've told you what a happiness question looks like. So this is data that came out yesterday on World Happiness Day in the 2019 World Happiness Report, which comes out on March 20th every year. And so this is showing us global happiness over time. And the blue line here is, yeah. Thank you. So the blue line is what happens if we weight countries by population. So this is our best estimate of the global average life satisfaction. And you can see that it has been going down for the last 5 years now, significantly. The other lines, the orange one here is the non-population weighted, meaning this is country average data. So the average country has actually gone up in the last couple of years, not much change. And the gray line is if we just get rid of the 5 largest countries, and again average at the country level. So surely this bears explaining. In fact, you might notice that this decrease in recent years here is as large as the decrease that happened during the global recession, right, in global average life satisfaction. So that's sort of a pretty big piece of bad news. It'd be nice to dig into that, and the World Happiness Report from yesterday does that somewhat. Just for context, that was a cognitive evaluation of life. Here is a measure of negative affect. So how much during the day yesterday did you feel negative emotions? It's an average of a few negative emotions. You can see that's actually been increasing quite a bit. The average of positive emotions is a little bit more stable, but also arguably going down. We can also map it, of course. So here's what the global map, this is actually from 2016, looks like. So you can see that the happiest places in the world turn out to be in Scandinavia. The other maybe instantly remarkable thing about this is the enormous range. So on that 11-point scale from 0 to 10, the range is from, at the country level, the range is from 3 to 8. There are countries in which the average answer is 3 out of 10. Okay, so if you saw that question and thought, oh, that's a funny question, I'm sure everybody just kind of adapts to their situation, adapts to their aspirations adapt to their reality. That's very obviously not the case just from a quick glance at the global data. We can of course also have a look at what happens to individual countries over time. Here are just a few rather fast trending countries. So I've told you that the global average range is from 3, the country average range is from 3 to 8. You can see here an example of Venezuela, which has dropped in the last few years nearly half the global range, right? So some countries are undergoing very large changes and sort of coherent changes over time. So if we want to start understanding why, we would model these differences or model the changes over time at the country level. And so if we do that, we'll find something like this. So these are standardized coefficients saying how much of the change in life valuations are explained by just these 6 variables. And the variables are essentially chosen because of what's available, what Gallup happens to ask. So here is income, healthy life expectancy, corruption, belief in corruption of the government, sense of freedom, the prevalence of financial donations, controlling for income, and whether or not people have friends and family to rely on in time of need. And so a quick glance at this tells you that a lot of the changes over time seem to be explained by things other than income and life expectancy, which are some nice objective indicators that we might look to first. And in fact, we could spend a whole hour or more looking at studies like this, in which things like trust and relationship quality and quantity, belonging, work relationships and meaning, friendships, intimate relationships, and other aspects of life turn out to be relatively important compared with income. We could do this across countries, we could do it at the individual level, within countries. Even within developing countries, that's true. Even within calorie-limited societies, that's essentially true. Here's what if the ability to predict changes over this period look like. This is actually a 2-period change, taking out some time right after the global recession, so that it's not dominated by that. So you have the actual cognitive life evaluation on the vertical scale and the predicted life evaluation. And again, the projector is not showing my light colors here very well. But this is these 6 variables. And so I'm now going to group them into 2 groups: income and life expectancy. I'm going to call those material variables, material predictors. And the friends variable, trust, giving, and freedom as non-material things. And I'm going to ask the question, how much might a well-being approach to policy matter? Now, I don't have a detailed predictive model, and I've got 6 variables to work with. So I'm going to do the following thought experiment to generate scenarios in 2050. And so in one scenario in 2050, all of the drivers, I'm going to shut down the material drivers of life satisfaction, of well-being in the model. And in another, I'm going to have only the material drivers. Now, in order to get a scale for, and so my question is going to be, how much could things change? And in order to figure that out, I'm going to look at how much those driving variables changed over the last 12 years. Okay, so I'm going to unfortunately, even that is going to be hard for you to see at the back. So I have 4 scenarios here. The top 2 are material scenarios, and in the left one, in every country in the world, the change within a country in income and in life expectancy has progressed at a pessimistic rate of the 30th percentile of what we've actually observed in the last decade. Right? In other words, a reasonable sort of possible rate of change, it seems it's actually within the reasonable distribution. And I'm not saying that everything is policy driven, but it seemed like if we are able to differentiate with policy between outcomes of countries somehow, then this is something maybe somewhat attainable. And on the right at the top is the 70th percentile, in other words, countries that have had better outcomes in terms of income. In other words, every country is going to progress at that rate, characterizing 70th percentile of what we saw. And in the bottom is the same thing for non-material. So to translate the takeaway from this image is that there is in some sense not all that much difference in the top row. In both cases, countries are all improving slightly. So in the pessimistic scenario, things aren't much getting worse. In the optimistic scenario, things are getting better for everyone, but not that much. If instead we look at the variation that seems to be driven by the non-material variables, we find an enormous variation in outcomes by 2050. And they range from completely horrible, a major regression of all countries to much worse situation than the average today, to vastly better lives for everybody. So to quantify that a little bit better, this red triangle here is this red triangle is where average global life satisfaction is today. And this range here is from the 10th to 9th percentile in light bar, or 30th to 70th percentile. This is the range of possible futures we envision for 2050 if we were to, in some sense, optimize our policies for these non-material factors of life. And at the top is the range if we were to optimize factors targeting those material aspects of life, and controlling for the other ones, right? And there's a third scenario which is also material based solely on OECD predictions of pessimistic and optimistic outcomes for 2050, and it looks essentially identical in range. Okay. So so that's sort of the context of this idea that, and this is very crude, but policy is complex, and so all we can do is kind of paint these scenarios right now rather than say this is exactly the policy sequence is going to get us somewhere. It's an argument for understanding and focusing on this enormous potential and risk in the scope of these not so well measured and somewhat ignored aspects of policy. So I'm going to give a super brief history of sort of how we got here, what I call how we got to the new dawn, and then I'm going to talk about three topics: health, education, and cities, quite briefly. And that's 3 out of 6 that are going to be covered, at least for the next few years, in each year of the World Happiness and Wellbeing Policy Report. Okay, skipping the kind of older stuff here, let's start in 1972. I just want to refer to a few things which you have probably heard of and put them into a bit of context. So you've heard of maybe gross national happiness associated with Bhutan. This is actually a kind of off-the-cuff conversation that happened in 1972, where the king said, as a rhetorical construct, gross national happiness is more important than gross national product. But it stuck, and he started thinking about it, and used that as, I would say, sort of a rhetorical or organizing concept for policies that seemed to be good for people that were not focused on the conventional economic outcomes per se. But over time, it became a little bit more formal, as you'll see in a second. So in around the same time, the economics of happiness kind of was founded by two different people in the early 1970s who started looking at life satisfaction data and thinking about empirical welfare in that sense, rather than assuming we could figure out what's good for people by behavior. And that included the Eastlands Paradox, which is this idea that countries don't seem to be getting happier as they get wealthier. In 2008, Bhutan actually took a step to sort of put its money where its mouth had been for a while, and it started to measure a defined gross national happiness. It's a complex measure with 8 domains and a bunch of indicators. It started to measure it quantitatively and set up government institutions to actually to communicate across departments and make sure that policies were in alignment with gross national happiness, as well as measuring it regularly. And so in 2008, the first survey was conducted in Bhutan. 2009, you may have heard of Sarkozy's initiative, often called the Stiglitz Report, which was focused on replacing our GDP-focused metrics by well-being metrics. There he is. And in fact, in the same year, David Cameron, who had been following the happiness literature for quite some time and interested in it, started to actually implement in government. And what they did was quite profound. And in fact, it required an enormous level of trust across the executive government branches, including the Treasury, but also and the Office of National Statistics. As well as to the civil service. And so they did a couple of things. They went a tour around the country in order to have a sort of democratically generated definition of what people value, what well-being was. And they also set up government bodies to, again, think about allocating resources in line with well-being. And So they became a leader in measuring life satisfaction as well as some other dimensions of well-being then, and in fact have still a very rich ecosystem of private and sort of government partnership organizations which are thinking about policy on different scales, and I'll come back to mention a couple of them in a moment. So in 2011, the UN General Assembly defined happiness as a fundamental human objective, and a year later, the first World Happiness Report was published, and and so let's see. So I keep moving quickly here. So and also the World Happiness Day of March 20th was declared a year later, and so now what happens every year on March 20th is another issue of this gets released. And it's sort of an interesting object. It's not peer-reviewed, but it's it's based on the latest peer-reviewed research, and it has a very cutting-edge quality to it. It's sort of the latest ideas in research with several chapters on specific themes to try and communicate the science as well as the state of and trends in national level life satisfaction and related variables each year. Okay, so in 2013, the OECD wrote a handbook on how to measure well-being for governments. Life satisfaction was designated as a sort of key metric. U.S. national academies did the same thing. And then the UAE got interested and sort of took a leadership position in thinking about policy, and they appointed a minister of happiness. She's still there. She's wonderful. And they got together a global council for happiness and well-being. And the idea was to essentially the goal of the Global World Happiness Report, which is to bring policy ideas together, because there are a few countries which have enough data to actually do the kind of analysis that they need to do, but to accelerate the development and transmission of ideas for happiness-related policies. There's Minister, okay, there's actually even a happiness. So this report gets released now every year in Dubai at the World Government Summit. That is the Happiness Council meeting this year. Okay, so and in 2018, this first report was published, and that may come out every year, at least for the next few. And so the goal here was to go through a few highlights, maybe as an investment to read this report. I think it's very interesting. A lot of it's extremely well written, and just give a sense of what's in there. As I said earlier, there's this transition. The premise here is this transition from a lot of sort of bottom-up initiatives that are focused on well-being and that are inspired by the science of well-being. As an example, the Faculty of Medicine has an office whose goal is to provide resources that protect and enhance the learner's health and well-being for all students in the medical faculty here. Some of these organizations I mentioned in the UK have done a lot of this kind of work. So, here's a plot of different, also hard to see, it's got time and effort on the horizontal axis and happiness boost that you'll get on the vertical. So, it's not obvious that keeping a gratitude journal regularly does more for your happiness than going on a vacation, and happens to cost less in terms of time and effort and other resources. In some sense, you can find this or you can stare at it a while, it's sort of interesting. In some sense, this really reflects things that are just in our genetic makeup, right? These are not obvious. These are empirical findings. And so they have a lot of great material which is useful at the individual and sort of organizational level. That's another great organization that thinks about slightly larger policy scale. And so I'm going to skip through these, but just the theme here is that there's this, there are a lot of examples now that are sort of at this small and mesoscale, and I want to talk about bigger picture policy a little bit. But a common theme amongst all these initiatives, what happens if you want to bring well-being thinking into your organization, is that you think about well-being of everybody. So a very common theme is if you're a provider of something, you start thinking about the well-being of the people who are providing and the process in which you are generating your outcome as well as the target audience. right? And that's also an extremely important thing in government, and it'll come up a couple times. There's also a lot of this kind of stuff going on in businesses. So I'll tell you the story. HSBC is an interesting case, but there are many other places like that who are trying to transform their organizations based on this science. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about healthcare. We spend something like 10%. Now this is, I have to say, not my field, and from here on I'm largely giving you highlights from the report. We spend a lot of our resources on healthcare, and costs are going up. And two big reasons they're going up. One is aging. So the number of people over 80 years of age is going to triple by 2050. And another is innovation. So people estimate there's something like a 2% cost increase in healthcare every year due to technological developments. So, in every health system, part of the job of the health system is rationing. In some sense, like all policy, you have to make decisions about allocating resources. And so how do you do that to do as much good as possible? And to state, something obvious, you can't make a decision without an objective. You need to have some way to measure different outcomes. And so the advice in this policy report is, like every chapter, think about the ultimate objective of health provision as happiness, as something like cognitive life evaluation, life satisfaction. And that changes a lot of stuff. Some of it in directions that are already sort of partly obvious. And actually, one reason why there are existing trends that maybe point a little bit in the same direction is that, in some sense, healthcare used to be targeted at bringing people back to health so they could go back into the manual labor force. That was a good idea in the first industrial revolution. In the third industrial revolution, the mind is an awful lot more important. And if your mind is not well, you're not going to be able to do your work. Just like if your arm is sore, you didn't used to be able to. And so medicine for the brain is increasingly important, and yet it's still completely dissociated often in our medical system, and in provision of services and in expertise even. Okay, so again, not my field, but if you want to choose which services to provide or allocate resources in a health system, you are stuck with these tools like disability-adjusted life years and quality-adjusted life years in order to figure out what the payoff, the cost-effectiveness of one treatment or action or program is going to be compared with another. And the report goes through a lot of reasons why these are quite problematic. I mean, the way that you, how can you do these kind of adjustments? You essentially ask people these questions that we call contingent valuations. So you ask somebody, here's two scenarios, two people with different illnesses or different conditions, and who do you think is healthier overall? And also making conditional judgments about trading off a health state versus longevity. And so these, I'm not going to be able to go into full detail explaining these, but this kind of an approach suffers from some pretty well-known psychological flaws. A focusing effect is that when you ask this kind of question, for a couple of reasons, you focus on health outcomes, even though in reality other things may be varying at the same time, and in fact maybe even more important. And you also focus on things that are just more vivid. So it's easier to imagine pain than it is to imagine anxiety. And when you're trading off, say, years of life, it's hard to think about how some conditions may be unaffected, such as relationships, works, or hobbies, when you're thinking about changes in your health. And so the projection bias is actually related to the latter, that it's difficult to think about that adaptation. Okay, so if my situation changes, it's very hard to understand how you may adapt to certain changes you're thinking about and how other things may actually persist. On the other hand, sort of an exception to that is mental disorders. So anxiety and depression are by their very nature occupying your mind, and so you can't adapt to those. They are in the forefront of your mind. Whereas other things, if I injured my arm or lost my arm, that would be at the forefront of my mind for maybe a relatively limited amount of time compared to what I would assess introspectively. Okay, so all of these things are actually, you can do better by looking at data of how people actually reflect on their lives in given situations and given outcomes than you can by asking people to project in this way. So we might summarize all of those by saying that anxiety and pain need much more emphasis as compared with things like mobility and usual activities when thinking about costs and benefits. So here are some recommendations on health. They make it sort of the basic point that things should be optimized. In other words, the kind of healthcare appraisal systems, HCAs, that are used should be used to appraise, to make choices, including disinvesting from things that are not worthwhile anymore or don't appear to be anymore. And the opportunity costs need to be taken into account properly, meaning alternative uses of resources. And this is actually quite fundamental to bringing well-being into policy. And it's quite profound. It's the following thing, that if I'm making decisions in a health Department of Health, I'm focused only on what I can do through the health system. But if I was able to have a sort of commensurable measured outcome between social policies, housing policies, and health policies, then I could actually make the resource assessments properly across those. And of course, they're also very integrated. And so if I'm thinking about policy in terms of a single outcome, then these divisions between departments in government start to dissolve, and the ability to choose properly between alternative uses of resources is improved. And so the third recommendation is what I mentioned at the beginning. Common theme in this report is to use happiness as the objective and not all the things that we do now, say, to be brief. And another is to include in one's calculations of policy, include the effects on everybody, not just the patient. And so it turns out a lot of the effects on carers and family are a little bit more in the mental domain than the physical, and so they also get overlooked, even for the reasons I've explained, even when one tries to take them into account. And it's also not obvious. So being in a caring role can be good for your life satisfaction. If you're doing 1 to 5 hours, this is one study, but if you're doing 1 to 5 hours of caring for somebody, it actually adds to your sense of meaning and purpose in life, and you end up happier. If you're doing much more, say over 11 hours per week, then it's got all kinds of bad effects. And you have higher incidence of anxiety, depression, poor sleep, social isolation, as well as things like reduced productivity, which are already taken into account well. And another, so greater priority of mental health. People say that there's a global mental health crisis is well under young people. The rates of global health issues under young people is accelerating. And then another one, a big one, is improved end-of-life care. And there's here also an awful lot of maybe radical changes that would come about if you took seriously patients' actual experience and also that of the family in terms of how those last 6 months or a couple of years, and then in fact even hours, look. Okay. They give a few examples of policies that are in the health chapter, and I just thought this is interesting because they point to this fact that it's very difficult to think about health outcomes in a siloed way, right? In fact, you hear this from doctors, that it can be very frustrating when they're going and working in a hospital every day, and it seems like the problems that they're actually up against are social issues. So raising taxes on alcohol was one. School-based social emotional learning, which I'll talk about next. Addressing loneliness. So being lonely has the same predictive health outcomes as smoking. turns out, and it's probably even worse for life satisfaction, and then again end of life care. Okay, so I'm trying to wrap up here in the next 5-10 minutes, so we have at least 15 minutes for questions. So let's talk about education. I can't do this without a bit of a preface on young people. In some sense, I feel that young people are oppressed in the world at the moment because young people are excluded from power, which I think matters more than ever before in the history of the world, in the sense that things are changing a lot and the decisions we're making have very clear long-term implications. At the same time, we're not giving young people a hopeful story anymore, which I'm going to come back to in my concluding thought. And there's also, from all these different lines of evidence, we know now that we need to shift society's resources towards investing in the young for a very simple economic reason, a very simple investment problem reason, which is that because of all we learned about, say, epigenetics, and actually it's true in the happiness literature as well, early life has enormous impacts on the rest of life, more than we could understand before we understood epigenetics, more than we could understand before we had data on, say, the impact of adverse childhood experiences on lifetime outcomes. So I feel like we have a world in which teachers are underpaid, we don't put enough resources into the beginning of life, we're still putting an awful lot in, as we just talked about, in healthcare at the very end. But what the well-being literature brings to this is to say something slightly different, which is that investment in young people should not be about, say, training people for the labor market, which might have been a good idea again in past centuries, but should be about well-being, right? The purpose of education and other investments in children should be the children's well-being and the well-being of those future selves. So, what would that mean? It means that instead of traditional things, and I'm not criticizing, education is very complex and very variable from one place to the next, but there's now a huge array of experiments that have gone on in all kinds of countries in which the explicit measurements of outcomes include well-being of the children. So something like life satisfaction targeted for children or young adults. And the skills taught are skills for being happier. And so that includes everything from better training about how to keep yourself healthy, better training about mental health, and then explicit training about social and emotional skills, or what people call non-cognitive skills. So you can argue that all these things have been on the agenda already, but thinking about current and future well-being gives a unifying framework for them, and it goes beyond the social and emotional skills somewhat. So this term of positive education is used to refer to actually explicitly teaching people things that are going to have measurable outcomes for well-being in the sense that we're discussing. The other thing to say here, and I've mentioned this before about providers as well as target audiences, is that the well-being of teachers is intimately related to the well-being of students. And so it's one of the bits of experience from a lot of these trials is actually it's so complex to transform a curriculum and a school system and objective metrics. It's an enormous burden on teachers who are already time poor and stressed out. And so one way to go about it is, in fact, applying this curriculum and the insights of positive psychology or everything that goes into this to the teachers first. Make sure the teachers know how to do all of these skills of looking after their own well-being first before trying to change the curriculum. There are plenty of case studies in the report. So I'm just going to flip through this, but there's a large network of universities in Mexico which has transformed its entire structure and curriculum towards a well-being focus. To give you a sense of the scale, here's the training. This is sort of certified training that that people have undergone, not students, but the staff, employees, university leaders, and faculty. Training in certified positive psychology organizational management and life purpose. So this is an enormous investment. There are a number now of RCTs, although this is developing literature. A lot of the early investments in social and emotional skills were actually targeted for cognitive outcomes still. Here's a map of positive education websites, so to give you some idea of how broadly these things are being applied around the world. And the scale of outcomes is rather extraordinary. So when you do focus on all of these non-cognitive skills, sort of as a, it's almost not fortuitous for the science, for the policy of well-being, that the outcomes in the cognitive skills, in the standardized tests even go up better than anything else that people have tried. So, the ideology that goes into this can kind of get lost because the traditional outcomes are so much better. So these are RCTs of positive education programs in Mexico, Peru, and Bhutan, where the standardized test scores go up by 0.2, 0.3, 0.5 standard deviations, which more or less blows away all the other interventions of which people are spending billions of dollars on schooling interventions. These are large effects. Okay, and then these are non-cognitive outcomes also, which, as you might imagine, have measurable positive outcomes, short and long term now. So there are many barriers to transforming schools. I've already touched on a few of these, but there's a lot of organizational stuff. Okay, I'm going to basically skip one of my favorite topics, but again, it's not my expertise, and it's well covered in the report. And this is how to design happy cities. So just let me give you a glance here of the summary graphic from the report. And these are kind of the domains in which policy can make life better in cities. And these are the outcomes that are relevant. And it's really, this is on the right is a map of what the life satisfaction literature says are important supports for people. So this is a exciting literature, again, now with a lot of small-scale experiments in cities all around the world. And this is really now an effort to bring, consolidate that experience and think about mainstreaming these kind of ideas. Okay, so let me just say, in fact, there's an organization called the New Cities Foundation, which is based here in Montreal, and they'll be having a Wellbeing Cities Forum here in the summer, in case you're interested in that. Okay, a couple of things about big picture. How does government policy making look different? And I've already said all of these things, but let me just touch on a couple again. Actually, I think we live in a time in which, in some sense, we need to radically reform governance, right? We have a system which is not great at making very long-term decisions, and lives in a world, and we're in a world in which things are changing. Technology is changing so fast. We also don't have governments that are able to respond fast enough to the changing technology. So it's sort of nice to have a bit of a blank slate and think about how do we make decisions in that environment. And of course, anytime you're making big decisions, you want to be starting out with the right objective, which is the theme of happiness-based policymaking. But some things that don't look completely radical are just, as I mentioned, distinctions between different departments of policy melt a little bit when everybody is focused on well-being as an outcome. And that's true even at the front line. So if you think about somebody, if you call up a helpline, a city helpline in Montreal, and you're getting advice on a particular domain, if their objectives are not just the narrow outcomes in that domain, but are related to the bigger picture of say, your well-being, they're much more likely going to be able to phone up somebody else and say, hey, this person's housing situation isn't working out, or so on. So you need an awful lot of. There's the option and the need for an awful lot of social capital within all levels of government, vertically and horizontally, in order to get this kind of transformation to happen. So cross-sector prioritization is necessary, which means the kind of trade-offs it may be easier to make trade-offs between state government departments when you can measure the outcomes in the same language. And then also, an ongoing theme in this field is that as we learn about all of these, say, non-material outcomes that are maybe harder to measure or not traditionally measured, as we learn how important those are, we also change our measurement systems. And we're a bit of a leader in that in Canada, but there's a lot of aspects of the kind of stuff that was on the right in here that we still don't measure very well as sort of intermediate outcomes. Okay, let me end on a couple of examples that sort of deep change can happen. What would it look like to me? It would look like the budgeting process actually changes so that well-being comes into the allocation of money at the very top level of government, or that governments are held explicitly accountable to well-being measures. So here's an act in Wales which does something like the latter. And here, brand new in New Zealand, is an act, I don't think we have the audio set up, I'm going to skip that, is a well-being budgeting system. So this is now all budget allocations actually go through a screening process in which they're accountable to well-being outcomes according to the best knowledge that we have. This is obviously something, the knowledge continues to evolve, but it's a sensible accounting system in which the bottom line is human experience. Okay, this is a quick list of how many countries are now regularly measuring life satisfaction. That's probably out of date, it's already increasing. Something I'd love to see in Canada before not too long. Bhutan, in its most recent census, has life satisfaction on the census. So that's something I can imagine also becoming standard. Okay, I will leave that for discussion if somebody asks me. And I just want to say, as a last note, that for me, one of the most profound things about thinking about happiness-based policy is that it becomes relatively easy to paint a positive picture of our future. And it seems to me that one of our crises right now, in democracy or in evidential reasoning in public discourse, is that many people are dealing with a form of cognitive dissonance that comes from not having a positive story, not being empowered to do something that leads to do something in a story which has a positive outcome. Young people are being told that we have all of these things coming down the pipe which are threatening, and they don't know, where to jump in and fix things. And so when people are afraid, we know very well from psychology that they start thinking more short-term, measurably. They start thinking defensively. They become less creative, measurably. They become less outgoing, less pro-social. They start building walls instead of reaching out. And it turns out, I call this fortuitous, that what the science of well-being tells us is that there's so much scope for improving lives through these non-material parts of policy that we can actually make life better for everybody at the same time as we're bringing in a lot of constraints, which you might say we need to do for ecological reasons and for other resource limitation reasons. And so there is in principle at least a story in which we're dealing with the large problems that we're facing and the rapid changes we're facing at the same time as rationally improving lives for people. And so I don't really know another way to paint a policy story in which we have, in which we have non-threatening outcomes in the future. And so I hope that this kind of transformation that we're at the beginning of leads us to that. Thank you.